My name is Serafina Hartwell. I'm 20 years old, and 2 years ago my parents literally threw me out with nothing but the clothes on my back. What I discovered last week about why they really kicked me out has shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. The truth wasn't just devastating, it was criminal. And now, as I sit in this lawyer's office, holding documents that prove my parents have been living off money that was rightfully mine since birth, I finally understand that their cruelty wasn't random. It was calculated theft disguised as tough love. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this absolutely wild family revenge story, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? If you're ready for a tale of family betrayal that'll make your jaw drop, smash that like button and subscribe, because this story has more twists than a soap opera. Trust me, you'll want to see how karma serves justice on a silver platter. Let's get into it. Growing up, I thought I had the perfect family. The Hartwells were respected in our upscale Connecticut neighborhood. Dad was a successful investment banker, Mom ran a high-end interior design firm, and my older brother Marcus was the golden child who could do no wrong. We lived in a sprawling colonial house with manicured lawns, took expensive vacations, and I attended private school where tuition cost more than most people's annual salary. But there were always subtle signs something was off. While Marcus got a brand new BMW for his 16th birthday, I was told I needed to earn my privileges. When he struggled in school, they hired expensive tutors. When I excelled academically, maintaining a 4 gigapascals, they barely acknowledged it. I convinced myself it was because I was younger, or because they wanted to teach me responsibility. The real red flags started appearing during my senior year. Marcus had already graduated and was living it up at Yale, all expenses paid naturally. Meanwhile, my parents grew increasingly cold toward me. They'd have hushed conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. When I asked about college funding, Dad would get this strange look in his eyes and say we'd discuss it later. That discussion never came. Instead, what came was a letter from my dream school, Stanford, accepting me with a partial scholarship. I was ecstatic, running to show my parents, expecting them to be proud. Instead, Mom barely looked up from her wine glass and said, "Well, I hope you've been saving your babysitting money." I laughed, thinking she was joking. But Dad's expression was stone cold. "We're not paying for college, Serafina. You're 18 now. Time to figure things out yourself." The room went silent, except for the ticking of their expensive grandfather clock. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline that never came. But Marcus's tuition to Yale. Marcus is different, Mom said finally, looking at me with eyes that held no warmth. He's our investment in the family legacy. You need to learn to stand on your own feet. That night I lay awake trying to process what had happened. Had I done something wrong? Was this some kind of twisted life lesson? I replayed every interaction from the past year, searching for clues about when exactly I had fallen from grace. The answer came 3 weeks later when I overheard them on the phone with Marcus. Dad was laughing, telling him about some financial relief they'd experienced recently. "Don't worry about grad school funding," he said. "We've got everything covered now. That burden has been resolved." The way he said burden made my blood run cold. Were they talking about me? My suspicions were confirmed when I found college brochures for expensive private schools hidden in Marcus's old room. Not for him, but with my name on them. Brochures from 2 years ago, before their attitude toward me changed. Someone had been planning for my education, setting money aside, making preparations, and then suddenly those plans had vanished. The final blow came on graduation day. While other families celebrated with expensive dinners and gift exchanges, my parents sat through the ceremony like they were attending a funeral. When the principal announced I'd received a full academic scholarship to Stanford after my partial one was upgraded, the auditorium erupted in applause. I looked for my parents' faces in the crowd, hoping to see pride. Instead, I saw fury. That night they sat me down for what they called a family meeting. The words they spoke will be burned into my memory forever. Serafina, you're 18 now, which means you're legally an adult. We've decided it's time for you to experience the real world. We won't be supporting you financially anymore. Not for college, not for anything. You have until Sunday to find somewhere else to live. I stared at them in shock. This is about Stanford, isn't it? You're angry that I got the scholarship. Mom's laugh was bitter. Angry, sweetheart, we're relieved. Now we don't have to pretend anymore. Pretend what? But they wouldn't answer. Dad simply stood up, straightened his tie, and delivered the line that would haunt me. Good luck on the streets, Serafina. Maybe this will teach you that life isn't a fairy tale. Those first months on my own were the hardest of my life. With nowhere to go and no family support, I couch surfed with friends until their parents grew uncomfortable housing someone whose own family had disowned them. The questions in their eyes hurt almost as much as my parents' rejection. What had I done to deserve this? I worked 3 jobs that summer. Morning shifts at a coffee shop, afternoons at a retail store, and evenings babysitting. Every penny went towards securing a tiny studio apartment in a sketchy part of town. The place was barely bigger than my childhood walk-in closet, with thin walls that let in every sound from the drug deals happening in the hallway. Starting Stanford in the fall felt surreal. Here I was surrounded by students whose biggest worry was choosing between their BMW or Mercedes for weekend trips, while I was calculating whether I could afford both textbooks and groceries that week. My scholarship covered tuition and basic housing, but everything else, food, clothes, books, basic necessities, came out of my minimum wage earnings. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. If my parents thought abandoning me would break me, they were wrong. Every A+ was a small victory, every scholarship award a step further away from the people who'd tried to destroy my future. I majored in business and finance partly because I was good at it, but mostly because I wanted to understand money, how people got it, kept it, and used it as a weapon. During my sophomore year, I landed an internship at a prestigious accounting firm. The work was demanding, but it opened my eyes to the intricate world of financial records, tax documents, and money trails. I became fascinated by forensic accounting, the art of following money to uncover fraud and financial crimes. It was during this internship that I first learned about trust funds and inheritance laws. A casual conversation with my supervisor about a case involving misappropriated family funds made my stomach drop. She mentioned how common it was for parents to steal from their children's trusts, thinking they'd never get caught. The thing is, she said, these kids usually have no idea the money even exists until they're much older. Sometimes parents spend decades living off funds that were meant for their children's education or inheritance. That night, I couldn't sleep. A terrible thought had taken root in my mind, growing stronger with each passing hour. What if my parents' sudden financial confidence about Marcus's future wasn't because of their own success? What if there was money that should have been mine? I spent weeks researching my family's financial history using skills I'd learned in my accounting classes. What I found made my hands shake. There were records of a substantial trust fund established in my name by my grandmother, my father's mother, who had died when I was 12. The same grandmother who had always told me I was her special girl and that she'd make sure I was taken care of. But accessing the trust fund records would require more than internet research. I needed professional help, and that meant taking a risk that could backfire spectacularly. The decision to hire a private investigator came after months of internal debate. It cost me nearly every penny I'd saved, money I'd planned to use for graduate school applications. But something deep in my gut told me this was bigger than just a hunch. Detective Maria Santos was a former police officer who specialized in financial crimes. When I laid out my suspicions, she listened with the intensity of someone who'd heard similar stories before. Family financial abuse is more common than people think, she said. And if your grandmother did establish a trust fund, there should be paper trails. The question is whether your parents have been careful enough to cover their tracks. 3 months into Detective Santos's investigation, the first evidence arrived that changed everything. She'd found records of the trust fund my grandmother had established, and it was substantial. More than substantial. It was life-changing money that should have funded not just my college education but graduate school, a house down payment, and left me financially secure for years. The trust had been set up to release funds for my education starting at age 16 with full access granted at 25. But according to the bank records Santos obtained, my parents had been named as trustees with the power to make distributions for my educational and welfare needs. Instead of using the money for its intended purpose, they'd been systematically draining it for years. Every expensive vacation Marcus took, every luxury car they bought him, every dollar of his Yale tuition, it had all come from my inheritance. They'd been stealing from me to fund their golden child's life, while telling me I needed to learn responsibility and self-reliance. The documents Santos showed me painted a picture of calculated theft spanning years. There were distributions labeled as Serafina's educational expenses that coincided with Marcus's tuition payments. Medical and welfare needs that mysteriously aligned with their family vacations to Europe. Even their recent kitchen renovation had been funded with a withdrawal marked as my living expenses. But the most damning evidence was a series of emails Detective Santos had recovered from a digital forensics expert. My parents had been communicating with a lawyer about ways to minimize distributions from my trust fund, with Dad writing, "We need to ensure the bulk of these funds remain available for Marcus's graduate education and future business ventures. Serafina's portion should be limited to the absolute minimum required by law." Mom's response was even more chilling. "I've never felt comfortable with Mother's decision to favor Serafina in the trust anyway. This money should support our family's legacy, not enable a child who's never shown proper gratitude." Reading those words felt like being punched in the stomach. They hadn't just stolen my money, they convinced themselves they were entitled to it. In their minds, I was the ungrateful child who didn't deserve what my grandmother had left me. The investigation revealed that they'd been planning my financial abandonment for months before my 18th birthday. There were searches on Dad's computer about emancipating adult children and parental financial obligations. They'd consulted with lawyers about the minimum they were legally required to provide before cutting me off. Every cruel word, every cold shoulder, every moment of rejection suddenly made sense. They weren't teaching me a lesson about independence, they were eliminating a financial threat to their theft. Santos also discovered something that made my blood boil. My parents had been telling people in our community that I'd become rebellious and ungrateful, and that cutting me off was a last resort to teach me values. They'd painted themselves as the suffering parents of a wayward child garnering sympathy while living off my stolen inheritance. But here's where the story gets even more twisted, and this is something that still gives me chills thinking about it. Detective Santos found evidence that this wasn't their first time manipulating family finances. When my father's elderly uncle had died 3 years earlier, leaving money to both my father and uncle's caregiver, my parents had contested the will. They'd convinced the family that the caregiver had manipulated their uncle, eventually settling out of court. The caregiver, a single mother who'd devoted 2 years to caring for my great-uncle, had been forced to accept a fraction of what she'd been promised. The pattern was clear. My parents saw family money as their personal piggy bank, and anyone who threatened their access to it was an enemy to be eliminated. As I sat in Santos's office looking at bank statements and legal documents that proved my parents' betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: rage. Pure, justified rage at the people who were supposed to love and protect me but had instead stolen my future and tried to destroy my spirit. "What are my options?" I asked Santos. She smiled grimly. Well, the good news is that theft of trust funds is a serious crime. The bad news is that family financial crimes are complicated to prosecute. But there's another option that might be more satisfying. That's when she told me about civil recovery actions and the possibility of not just recovering my stolen funds, but pursuing damages for the emotional and financial harm they'd caused. More importantly, she explained that everything they'd done was documented in a way that would make their guilt undeniable. If you want to pursue this, Serafina, we can make sure they face consequences for what they've done. But you need to be prepared for this to get ugly. They're not going to go down without a fight. Looking at those documents, thinking about the nights I'd gone hungry while they dined at expensive restaurants with my money, thinking about Marcus living a life of luxury funded by my inheritance, I knew exactly what I wanted to. It was time for justice. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of legal preparation that felt like planning a military operation. Detective Santos had connected me with a law firm specializing in financial crimes and family trusts. The lead attorney, Rebecca Chen, took one look at the evidence and told me she'd rarely seen such a clear-cut case of trust fund abuse. Your parents made a crucial mistake, she explained during our first meeting. They documented everything. Every withdrawal, every justification, every email discussing how to minimize your access to the funds, it's all admissible evidence. They thought they were being careful, but they actually created a perfect paper trail of their crimes. The legal team worked with Detective Santos to build an airtight case. They subpoenaed bank records going back to when the trust was established, recovered deleted emails from my parents' computers, and even found social media posts where Mom had bragged about Marcus's expensive lifestyle while I was struggling to afford textbooks. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source, Marcus himself. It turns out my golden boy brother had been keeping detailed records of every gift payment and expense my parents had covered for him. He'd done this partly for tax purposes, but mostly because he was paranoid about money and wanted to track every dollar he'd received. His meticulous spreadsheets became the prosecution's smoking gun, showing exactly how my trust fund money had been redirected to fund his privileged lifestyle. When Detective Santos approached Marcus for questioning, his reaction was everything I could have hoped for. The interview was recorded, and his words still make me smile when I remember them. Wait, what do you mean that money was supposed to be for Serafina? He'd asked, panic creeping into his voice. Mom and Dad told me it was family money. They said Grandma left it for family educational expenses and that since I was the one actually pursuing education seriously, it made sense to invest in my future. Even in his shock, Marcus couldn't help but take a dig at me. But his admission that he'd known about the trust fund while I'd been kept in the dark was exactly what we needed. The investigation also revealed that my parents had made a critical error in their theft. They'd continued taking money even after I turned 18. Legally, once I became an adult, any distributions from the trust should have required my explicit consent or been made directly to me for legitimate educational expenses. Instead, they'd forged my signature on multiple documents and had even set up a fake email account in my name to authorize transfers. Attorney Chen was practically giddy when she saw the forged signatures. Identity theft, wire fraud, forgery. Your parents didn't just steal from you, Serafina. They committed multiple felonies in the process. As the case developed, we discovered that my parents had stolen approximately $340,000 from my trust fund over the course of 6 years. That money had funded Marcus's entire college experience, their luxury vacations, home renovations, and even the down payment on a vacation cabin in Vermont. Meanwhile, I'd been living in poverty, working multiple jobs and believing I was somehow deficient because my own family wouldn't support me. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court was particularly revealing. Doctor? Patricia Williams, a forensic psychologist specializing in family dynamics, concluded that my parents exhibited traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and financial abuse patterns. The defendants appear to have convinced themselves that their actions were justified, she wrote in her report. They demonstrate a complete lack of empathy for the victim and show no genuine remorse for the financial and emotional damage they've caused. Instead, they continue to frame themselves as the wronged parties, suggesting deep-seated personality disorders that make rehabilitation unlikely. But the most satisfying moment in the entire investigation came when Detective Santos told me about my parents' reaction to being served with the lawsuit. They'd been at one of their fancy country club dinners celebrating Marcus's acceptance to Harvard Business School, funded of course with my stolen money, when the process server found them. According to witnesses, Dad had turned completely white when he read the documents, while Mom had started screaming about ungrateful children and family loyalty. The entire country club had watched as my dignified, respectable parents melted down in public, with Mom reportedly throwing her wine glass and Dad storming out while shouting about teaching that girl a lesson she'll never forget. News of the lawsuit spread quickly through their social circle. The same community where they'd painted me as a rebellious disappointment suddenly learned the truth about their perfect family. Friends who'd believed their lies about my character were now seeing evidence of their financial crimes splashed across legal documents. The irony was delicious. They'd spent 2 years destroying my reputation to cover their tracks, and now their own crimes were destroying theirs. As we prepared for court, Attorney Chen warned me that my parents would likely try to paint me as a vindictive child, seeking revenge against loving parents who'd simply practiced tough love. They'd claim that cutting me off was meant to teach me independence, and that any trust fund distributions they'd made were within their rights as trustees. But we had something they didn't: the truth documented in their own words and actions. "Get ready," Serafina Chen told me as we finalized our court filing. "Your parents are about to learn that justice isn't just a concept, it's a consequence." The day of the first court hearing arrived like a reckoning I'd been waiting for my entire life. I walked into that courthouse wearing a suit I'd bought with money from my part-time job, money I'd earned through my own hard work while they'd been living off my stolen inheritance. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. My parents arrived with an expensive legal team looking every bit the prosperous couple they pretended to be. Dad wore his most intimidating business suit, while Mom was dressed like she was attending a charity gala rather than facing criminal charges. They barely glanced in my direction, but I could see the tension in their rigid postures. Marcus was there too, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past few months. The golden boy who'd never faced consequences for anything was about to watch his perfect world crumble, and he knew it. The preliminary hearing was mostly procedural, but watching my parents squirm as the judge read the charges aloud was incredibly satisfying. Theft of trust funds, identity theft, wire fraud, forgery. Each charge felt like a small victory for every night I'd gone hungry while they dined on my dime. But the real fireworks started during the deposition phase. Attorney Chen had prepared me for this moment, explaining that my parents' lawyers would try to break me down, to make me seem like a vindictive child rather than a victim of systematic financial abuse. Mom's deposition was a masterclass in narcissistic deflection. She sat there in her designer clothes purchased with my money and tried to paint herself as the victim. Serafina was always a difficult child, she testified, dabbing at fake tears. We tried everything to teach her gratitude and responsibility, but she seemed to think the world owed her something. Cutting her off was the hardest decision we ever made, but we hoped it would finally teach her the value of hard work. When Attorney Chen presented her with bank records showing luxury purchases made with trust fund money on the same days I'd been eating ramen noodles for dinner, Mom's facade cracked slightly. Those were family expenses, she insisted. The trust was meant to benefit the family, and we made decisions we thought were in everyone's best interest, including forging your daughter's signature," Chen asked, sliding a document across the table. "This authorization for a $15,000 withdrawal is dated 3 months after you kicked Serafina out, claiming you needed the money for her educational expenses. What education was this funding exactly?" Mom's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The lie was right there in black and white. Dad's deposition was even more revealing. His arrogance shone through as he tried to justify their actions with cold business logic. "I was managing the trust responsibly," he claimed. "Serafina was 18 and showing no signs of maturity or financial responsibility. It made more sense to invest those funds in Marcus's education, knowing he would use them wisely and eventually be able to support the family." "So you decided unilaterally that your son was more deserving of his sister's inheritance?" Chen pressed. "I decided what was best for the family as a whole," Dad replied, completely missing how damning his words sounded. The most explosive moment came when Chen presented him with the email where he'd called me a burden and discussed resolving the problem of my trust fund. "This email suggests you viewed your daughter's financial security as an obstacle to your plans for her brother. Is that accurate?" For the first time I saw my father truly rattled. His face flushed red and his voice rose defensively. "You're taking that completely out of context. We were trying to plan for both children's futures by stealing from one to fund the other. We weren't stealing, we were trustees. We had every right, you had the right to manage the funds for Serafina's benefit, not to redirect them to Marcus while lying to her about their existence." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Dad's heavy breathing. In that moment, watching him realize how trapped he was by his own words, I felt something shift inside me. The scared 18-year-old who'd believed she deserved abandonment was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth and wouldn't be silenced. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus took the stand. My golden boy brother, who'd lived his entire life knowing he was the favorite, finally had to face the truth about the cost of his privileges. "You knew this money was meant for your sister's education?" Chen asked. Marcus squirmed in his seat. I was told it was family money, for education expenses." "Whose education specifically?" I thought. "I assumed it was for whoever was in school at the time." "So, when your sister was 18 and had received a scholarship to Stanford, you thought it made sense that all the education funds should go to you instead?" "My parents said she was being rebellious and that investing in my education was more responsible. More responsible than using your sister's trust fund for its intended purpose." Marcus looked desperately at our parents, but they couldn't help him. The truth was finally coming out, and there was nowhere left to hide. "I didn't know she didn't know about the money," he whispered finally. "I thought she knew and just didn't care about college." That admission, that my own brother had known about my inheritance while I'd been kept in the dark, felt like the final piece of evidence I needed. Not just for the court case but for my own peace of mind. These people weren't my family. They were thieves who'd used blood relation as a cover for systematic abuse. As we left the courthouse that day, my parents' lawyer approached Attorney Chen with a settlement offer. They wanted to make this go away quietly before the criminal charges moved forward and the media attention intensified. Chen smiled grimly as she relayed their proposal to me. "They're offering to repay the stolen funds plus interest. No admission of guilt, no criminal charges. They want you to disappear again." I thought about that 18-year-old girl who'd been thrown out with nothing, who'd believed she was worthless enough to abandon. Then I looked at the evidence folder in my hands, proof that I'd been robbed, lied to, and systematically abused by the people who were supposed to love me most. "No," I said firmly. "They don't get to buy their way out of this. I want them to face the full consequences of what they've done." Justice wasn't just about getting my money back. It was about making sure they could never do this to anyone else. 6 months later, I sat in that same courtroom watching the judge deliver the verdict that would change everything. The civil trial had taken weeks, with my parents' expensive legal team desperately trying to frame their systematic theft as a family misunderstanding. But when you have bank records, forged signatures, and recorded admissions of guilt, there's only so much spin you can put on criminal behavior. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of deliberate financial abuse, Judge Martinez stated, her voice cutting through the silent courtroom. The defendants systematically stole from the plaintiff's trust fund, while simultaneously abandoning her financially and emotionally. This was not a case of poor judgment or family disagreement. This was calculated theft, accompanied by emotional abuse designed to cover their crimes. The judgment was everything Attorney Chen had hoped for and more. My parents were ordered to repay the full $340,000 they'd stolen plus $280,000 punitive damages plus interest and legal fees. The total came to nearly $700,000, double what they'd taken from me. But the financial judgment was just the beginning. The criminal charges had proceeded parallel to the civil case, and Dad was sentenced to 18 months in prison for wire fraud and identity theft. Mom received 12 months for her role in the conspiracy. Both were also sentenced to 5 years of probation and ordered to perform 500 hours of community service, specifically with organizations that help abandoned youth. The irony of my parents being forced to help kids they'd thrown away wasn't lost on anyone in that courtroom. Marcus, who'd been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, lost everything too. Harvard Business School withdrew his acceptance when the financial aid fraud came to light. It turned out that their application for financial aid had been based on false information about family assets. They'd hidden the trust fund money to qualify for need-based assistance. The school considered this grounds for permanent disqualification. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was watching their carefully constructed social facade crumble completely. The local newspaper covered the trial extensively, with headlines like "Prominent Family Convicted of Stealing Daughter's Inheritance" and "Country Club Couple Sentenced for Financial Abuse." Their friends abandoned them, the country club revoked their membership, and Dad's investment firm forced him to resign in disgrace. The same community where they'd spread lies about my character now knew the truth about theirs. Standing outside the courthouse after sentencing, Detective Santos handed me a folder with the final piece of the puzzle, a letter my grandmother had written to her lawyer when she established the trust fund. The lawyer had found it in his files and thought I should see it. "My dear Serafina," the letter began, "is a special soul who deserves every opportunity in life. I've seen how my son favors Marcus, and while I love both my grandchildren, I worry that Serafina won't receive the support she needs to flourish. This trust fund is my way of ensuring she can pursue her dreams without depending on anyone who might use money as a weapon against her." Even from beyond the grave, my grandmother had tried to protect me from exactly what had happened. Reading her words, I finally understood that I'd never been the problem. I'd been the target. With the settlement money, I paid off my student loans, bought a modest house near campus, and established my own scholarship fund for students from abusive families. I also started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping young adults who'd been financially cut off by their families. Detective Santos joined as my first board member, and we've already helped dozens of kids who found themselves in situations similar to mine. The organization is called Phoenix Rising because sometimes you have to burn down the old version of yourself to become who you're meant to be. I finished my degree summa cum laude and was accepted to Harvard Law School, the same program Marcus had lost. I'm specializing in family law and financial crimes with a focus on protecting vulnerable family members from financial abuse. Every case I take on, I think about that 18-year-old girl who believed she deserved abandonment. My parents served their time and were released last month. They lost their house, their savings, and their social standing. Dad works at a small accounting firm now, while Mom took a job at a retail store. Ironic considering she used to look down on people in service jobs. They've never once reached out to apologize or take responsibility for what they did. Marcus eventually found work at a small regional bank far from the Wall Street career he'd planned. He sent me one text message after the trial: "I didn't know they were lying to you." It wasn't an apology, just another attempt to absolve himself of responsibility. I never responded. Some bridges are meant to stay burned. But here's the thing about family karma that I want you to understand: justice isn't just about punishment. It's about breaking cycles of abuse and ensuring that harmful patterns don't continue. By exposing my parents' crimes, I didn't just get my money back. I prevented them from victimizing anyone else. The trust fund money my grandmother left me was meant to secure my future, and in a way it did exactly that. Not just financially, but by teaching me that I'm worth fighting for, that I deserve better than crumbs from people who claim to love me, and that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. So here's my question for you. Have you ever experienced family betrayal that made you question everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty? Have you seen karma come back around to serve justice to people who thought they were untouchable? I want to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps us all heal from family trauma. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life tales of justice served. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that they're worth more than how their family treats them. Sometimes, we need reminders that we're not alone in these experiences. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting this channel. Remember, you are worthy of love, respect, and all the opportunities life has to offer, regardless of what anyone, even family, has told you otherwise. Life has a way of revealing truth and serving justice even when it takes longer than we'd like. Keep rising, keep fighting for yourselves, and remember that the best revenge is building a life so beautiful that it makes their betrayal irrelevant.